Hello. This is sort of not at all a Valentine story, not remotely. I'm wearing hearts on this fine day. I'm going to read The Complete Gentleman by Nigerian writer Amos Tutuola, quite an eccentric fellow, I believe. And here we go. He was a beautiful, complete gentleman. He dressed with the finest and most costly clothes. All the parts of his body were completed. He was a tall man, but stout. As this gentleman came to the market on that day, if he had been an article or animal for sale, he would be sold at least for £2,000. As this complete gentleman came to the market on that day, and at the same time that this lady saw him in the market, she did nothing more than to ask him where he was living. But this fine gentleman did not answer her or approach her at all. But when she noticed that the fine or complete gentleman did not listen to her, she left her articles and began to watch the movements of the complete gentleman about in the market, and left her articles unsold. By and by the market closed for that day. Then the whole people in the market were returning to their destinations, etc., and the complete gentleman was returning to his own too. But as this lady was following him about in the market all the while, she saw him when he was returning to his destination as others did. Then she was following him, complete gentleman, to an unknown place. But as she was following the complete gentleman along the road, he was telling her to go back or not to follow him, but the lady did not listen to what he was telling her, and when the complete gentleman had tired of telling her not to follow him or to go back to her town, he left her to follow him. But when they had travelled about 12 miles away from that market, they left the road on which they were travelling and started to travel inside an endless forest in which only all the terrible creatures were living. As they were travelling along in this endless forest, then the complete gentleman in the market that the lady was following began to return the hired parts of his body to the owners, and he was paying them the rentage money. When he reached where he hired the left foot, he pulled it out. He gave it to the owner and paid him, and they kept going. When they reached the place where he hired the right foot, he pulled it out and gave it to the owner and paid for the rentage. Now both feet had returned to the owners, so he began to crawl along on the ground. By that time, that lady wanted to go back to her town or her father, but the terrible and curious creature, or the complete gentleman, did not allow her to return or go back to her town or her father again, and the complete gentleman said thus: "I had told you not to follow me before we branched into this endless forest which belongs to only terrible and curious creatures. But when I became a half-bodied, incomplete gentleman, you wanted to go back. Now that cannot be done. You have failed. Even you have never seen anything yet. Just follow me." When they went furthermore, then they reached where he hired the belly, ribs, chest, etc. Then he pulled them out and gave them to the owner and paid for the rentage. Now to this gentleman or terrible creature remained only the head and both arms with neck. By that time he could not crawl as before, but only went jumping on as a bullfrog. And now this lady was soon faint for this fearful creature whom she was following. But when the lady saw every part of this complete gentleman in the market was spared or hired, and he was returning them to the owners, then she began to try all her efforts to return to her father's town, but she was not allowed by this fearful creature at all. When they reached where he hired both arms, he pulled them out and gave them to the owner. He paid for them, and they were still going on in this endless forest. They reached the place where he hired the neck. He pulled it out and gave it to the owner and paid for it as well. Now this complete gentleman was reduced to head, and when they reached where he hired the skin and flesh which covered the head, he returned them and paid the owner. Now the complete gentleman in the market reduced to a skull, and this lady remained with only skull. When the lady saw that she remained with only skull, she began to say that her father had been telling her to marry a man, but she did not listen to or believe him. When the lady saw that the gentleman became a skull, she began to faint, but the skull told her if she would die, she would die, and she would follow him to his house. But by the time that he was saying so, he was humming with a terrible voice and also grew very wild, and even if there was a person 2 miles away, he would not have to listen before hearing him. So this lady began to run away in that forest for her life. But the skull chased her, and within a few yards he caught her, because he was very clever and smart, as he was only skull, and he could jump a mile to the second before coming down. He caught the lady in this way, so when the lady was running away for her life, he hastily ran to her front and stopped her as a log of wood. By and by this lady followed the skull to his house, and the house was a hole under which was under the ground. When they reached there, both of them entered the hole. But they were only skulls living in that hole. At the same time that they entered the hole, he tied a single cowrie on the neck of this lady with a kind of rope. After that, he gave her a large frog on which she sat as a stool. Then he gave a whistle to a skull of this kind to keep watch on this lady whenever she wanted to run away. Because the skull knew already that the lady would attempt to run away from the hole. Then he went to the backyard to where his family was staying in the daytime till night. But one day the lady attempted to escape from the hole, and at the same time that the skull who was watching her whistled to the rest of the skulls that were in the backyard, the whole of them rushed out to the place where the lady sat on the bullfrog, so they caught her. But as all of them were rushing out, they were rolling on the ground as if 1,000 petrol drums were pushing along a hard road. After she was caught, then they brought her back to sit on the same frog as usual. If the skull who was watching her fell asleep, and if the lady wanted to escape, the cowrie that was tied on her neck would raise up the alarm with a terrible noise, so that the skull who was watching her would wake up at once, and then the rest of the skull's family would rush out from the back in thousands to the lady and ask her what she wanted to do with a curious and terrible voice. But the lady could not talk at all, because as the cowrie had been tied on her neck, she became dumb at the same moment. Now, as the father of the lady first asked for my name, and I told him that my name was Father of Gods who could do anything in this world, then he told me that if I could find out where his daughter was and bring her to him, then he would tell me where my palm wine tapster was. But when he said so, I was jumping up with gladness that he should promise me that he would tell me where my tapster was. I agreed to what he said. The father and parent of this lady never knew whereabouts their daughter was, but they had information that the lady followed a complete gentleman in the market. As I was the Father of Gods who could do anything in this world, when it was at night I sacrificed to my juju with a goat. And when it was early in the morning, I sent for 40 kegs of palm wine. After I had drunk it all, I started to investigate whereabouts was the lady. As it was the market day, I started the investigation from the market. But as I was a juju man, I knew all the kinds of people in that market. When it was exactly 9 a.m, the very complete gentleman whom the lady followed came to the market again, and at the same time that I saw him, I knew that he was a curious and terrible creature. I could not blame the lady for following the skull as a complete gentleman to his house at all, because if I were a lady, no doubt I would follow him to wherever he would go, and still, as I was a man, I would be jealous of him more than that, because if this gentleman went to the battlefield, surely enemy would not kill him or capture him, and if bombers saw him in a town which was to be bombed, they would not throw bombs on his presence, and if they did throw it, the bomb itself would not explode upon this gentleman because of his beauty. At the same time that I saw this gentleman in the market on that day, what I was doing was only to follow him about in the market. After I looked at him for so many hours, then I ran to a corner of the market and I cried for a few minutes, because I thought within myself, why was I not created with beauty as this gentleman? But when I remembered that he was only a skull, Then I thanked God that he had created me without beauty. So I went back to him in the market, but I was still attracted by his beauty. So when the market closed for that day, when everybody was returning to his or her destination, this gentleman was returning to his own too, and I followed him to know where he was living. When I travelled with him a distance of about 12 miles away to that market, the gentleman left the really road on which we were travelling and branched into an endless forest, and I was following him. But as I did not want him to see that I was following him, then I used one of my juju, which changed me into a lizard, and followed him. But after I had travelled with him a distance of about 25 miles away in this endless forest, he began to pull out all the parts of his body and return them to the owners, and paid them. After I had travelled with him for another 50 miles in this forest, then he reached his house and entered it, but I entered it also with him, as I was a lizard. The first thing that he did when he entered the whole house, he went straight to the place where the lady was, and I saw the lady sat on a bullfrog with a single cowrie tied on her neck, and a skull who was watching her stood behind her. After he, gentleman, had seen that the lady was there, he went to the backyard where all his family was working. When I saw this lady, and when the skull who brought her to that hole, or whom I followed from the market to that hole, went to the backyard, then I changed myself to a man as before. Then I talked to the lady, but she could not answer me at all. She only showed that she was in a serious condition. The skull, who was guarding her with a whistle, fell asleep at that time. To my surprise, when I helped the lady to stand up from the frog on which she sat, the cowrie that was tied on her neck made a curious noise at once, and when the skull who was watching her heard the noise, he woke up and blew the whistle to the rest. Then the whole of them rushed to the place and surrounded the lady and me, but at the same time that they saw me there, one of them ran to a pit which was not so far from that spot. The pit was filled with cowries. He picked one cowrie out of the pit. After that he was running towards me, and the whole crowd wanted to tie the cowrie on my neck too. But before they could do that, I had changed myself into air. They could not trace me out again, but I was looking at them. I believe that the cowries in that pit were their power, and to reduce the power of any human being whenever tied on his or her neck, and also to make a person dumb. Over 1 hour after I had dissolved into air, these skulls went back to the backyard, but there remained the skull who was watching her. After they had returned to the backyard, I changed to a man as usual. Then I took the lady from the frog, but at the same time that I touched her, the cowrie which was tied on her neck began to shout. Even if a person was 4 miles away, he would not have to listen before hearing. But immediately the skull who was watching her heard the noise and saw me. When I took her from that frog, he blew the whistle to the rest of them who were in the backyard. Immediately the whole skull family heard the whistle when blew to them. They were rushing out to the place, and before they could reach there, I had left their hole for the forest. But before I could travel about 100 yards in the forest, they had rushed out from their hole to inside the forest, and I was still running away with the lady. As these skulls were chasing me about in the forest, they were rolling on the ground like large stones and also humming with terrible noise. But when I saw that they had nearly caught me, or if I continued to run away like that, no doubt they would catch me sooner. Then I changed the lady to a kitten and put her inside my pocket and changed myself to a very small bird which I could describe as a sparrow in the English language. After that I flew away, but as I was flying in the sky, the cowrie which was tied on that lady's neck was still making a noise, and I tried all my best to stop the noise, but all were in vain. When I reached home with the lady, I changed her to a lady as she was before, and also myself changed to a man as well. When her father saw that I brought his daughter back home, he was exceedingly glad and said thus, "You are the father of gods, as you had told me before." But as the lady was now at home, the cowrie on her neck did not stop making a terrible noise, and she could not talk to anybody. She showed only that she was very glad she was at home. Now I had brought the lady, but she could not talk, eat, or loose away the cowrie on her neck, because the terrible noise of the cowrie did not allow anybody to rest or sleep. Now I began to cut the rope of the cowrie from her neck, and to make her talk and eat, but all my efforts were in vain. At last I tried my best to cut off the rope of the cowrie. It only stopped the noise, but I was unable to loose it away from her neck. When her father saw all my trouble, he thanked me greatly, and repeated again that as I called myself Father of gods who could do anything in this world, I ought to do the rest of the work. But when he said so, I was very ashamed, and thought within myself that if I returned to the skulls, hole, or house, they might kill me, and the forest was very dangerous travel always. Again, I could not go directly to the skulls in their hole, and ask them how to loose away the cowrie which was tied on the lady's neck, and to make her talk and eat. On the third day after I had brought the lady to her father's house, I returned to the endless forest for further investigation. When there remained about 1 mile to reach the whole of these skulls, there I saw the very skull who the lady had followed from the market as a complete gentleman to the whole of the skull's family's house, and at the same time that I saw him like that, I changed into a lizard and climbed a tree which was near him. He stood before 2 plants, then he cut a single opposite leaf from the opposite plant. He held the leaf with his right hand, and he was saying thus: "As this lady was taken from me, if this opposite leaf is not given her to eat, she will not talk for ever." After that he threw the leaf down on the ground. Then he cut another single compound leaf from the compound plant which was in the same place with the opposite plant. He held the compound leaf with his left hand, and said that if this single compound is not given to this lady to eat, the cowrie on her neck could not be loosened away for ever, and it would be making a terrible noise for ever. After he said so, he threw the leaf down at the same spot. Then he jumped away. So after he had jumped very far away, luckily I was there when he was doing all these things, and I saw the place that he threw both leaves separately. Then I changed myself to a man as before. I went to the place that he threw both leaves. Then I picked them up, and I went home at once. But at the same time that I reached home, I cooked both leaves separately and gave her to eat. To my surprise, the lady began to talk at once. After that, I gave her the compound leaf to eat for the second time, and immediately she ate that too. The cowrie, which was tied on her neck by the skull, loosened away by itself, but it disappeared at the same time. So when the father and mother saw the wonderful work which I had done for them, they brought 50 kegs of palm wine for me. They gave me the lady as wife, and 2 rooms in that house in which to live with them. So I saved the lady from the complete gentleman in the market, who afterwards reduced to a skull, and the lady became my wife since that day. This was how I got a wife. So that was The Complete Gentleman. Thank you very much.